Both Cáceres and De Niebla are taken to the local jail on the 20th of October 1509. On the 22nd, the judge is back. Judge slash prosecutor de Aguilar is back and calls to the stand a Cristobal de Valdovinos, who is otro criado de Solís. He is the one who brought Francisquito from El Marian. He chased him from all the way to where ID is now, back to Santiago. So he says, yeah, I went over there. I brought back Miguelico and Francisquito. I brought them to La Esperanza, the estate of Solis. He says that it was about 7 months ago that he was given this order. He ended up going all the way to an estate called Buyaba, owned by another encomendero called Francisco de Herrera in Puerto Real. He ended up going to El Cacique Arroyal in order to find out where Miguelico and Francisquito were located. Once he brought him back to Solis, Solis told him to tie up Francisquito. Cristobal de Valdovinos then decided to go eat something. And that from the kitchen, he heard what sounded like someone being beat. This being unexpected, he ran out to go see what was happening. He then found Francisquito being tied up with his hands above his head to the point where his feet barely touched the ground. And as he approached, he could hear the whip breaking into Francisquito's body. And that there were two people present. Francisco, el chocarrero, the jester, and another person who he didn't recall the name. Apparently, one of them was already beating Francisquito. And Valdovinos says that he saw how Solis brought up, se remangó his shirt, and proceeded to yank from the hands of the person who was currently beating Francisquito and said, give it to me. You don't know how to beat him. And that Solis then told Francisquito, ajura, higuerito. And that Francisquito would respond, ajura, señor, porque se vos acuerde. This portion, porque se vos acuerde, not clear who says that portion. Valdovino says that Solis beat him about 6 times and then that he untied him. The prosecutor asked Valdovinos, was it very clear and obvious that El Taino was already beaten by the time Solis began to assault him? He said yes. He definitely had signs that he had already been beaten, that he's pretty sure it was Francisco el Chocarrero who had already beaten him. Because he remembers Solis saying to el Chocarrero, veamos Francisco, ¿qué hombre serás? Para darle. And that he clearly saw Solis take the whip from El Chocarrero, and he was present while he whipped Francisquito. The prosecutor then asked him, so did Francisquito come sick? Like, did he have a fever? Did he have anything? Baldovino says no. He was obviously complaining because he was tied up while he was being walked back to La Esperanza in Santiago, but nothing else. He's then asked, do you know if he died from the beating that Solis gave him? And he says, I know he died later on that night. And that him, Valdovinos, and Chocarrero were the ones who went and gave Francisquito oil to try to purge him, to see if that would help. But he died that same night. And he doesn't think that what he was complaining about while being brought back to La Esperanza would have killed him, because he was eating and drinking and acting normally as he came back. But that he did see him dead. And they brought the body to El Bollo del Capitán. Capitán in this case was El Cacique that was assigned to Solis, because that's where he was taken after he had been assaulted. Lastly, the prosecutor asked Valdovinos if he had any ill will towards Solis, and he stated he didn't. They also asked him if he had been given anything for his testimony. He said no, that all he wanted was to see justice served, and that he was only 25 years old. And now the prosecutor calls up our first indigenous witness, Miguelico. What we know about Miguelico is that he is un indio que le pertenece a Solis, but it is not mentioned if he's a Nahoria, if he's, what is he? We don't know. It's not said that he's a slave, which we get with other indigenous people in the case, so we can assume that he is a Nahoria. We also know that Miguelico does not speak Spanish well. because he needs an interpreter. His interpreter is Alonso de Rivera. Alonso de Rivera is described as un vecino de Santiago, meaning he is Spanish. So here is our first fully bilingual Spanish who knows both the indigenous language of the island, at least one of them, and Castellano. The prosecutor asks Alonso de Rivera, the interpreter, to ask Miguelico what he knows about the death of Francisquito. The interpreter states that Miguelico says que en el tiempo de Balmaceda, well, I haven't been able to find who Balmaceda was, Francisquito huyó, and that Cristóbal de Valdovinos, criado de Solís, was ordered to bring back Francisquito. And he brought him back from El Marián, and that he himself was brought back with Francisquito because Cristóbal de Valdovinos also captured him, and that they were taken to La Hacienda La Esperanza, owned by Solís. He was then asked if he had personally seen Francisquito being tied up with his hands above his head and the tips of his feet bare touching the ground. Miguelico said yes, he did see that, and that by order of Solís, Francisco el Chocarrero had then beaten Francisquito with the saddle strap of a horse. He gave him 40 lashes, and that Solís then snatched the saddle strap from el Chocarrero and proceeded to beat Francisquito himself, and that with each lash, he would say, "Ajura, higuerito," and Francisquito would respond, "Ajura, señor, porque vos acordés." And that when Solís began beating Francisquito, que ya el dicho indio tenía corriendo sangre las espaldas y que luego lo hizo desatar. Francisquito was then sent to El Bollo del Capitán, where he agonized, and that the next day he died. They buried him. Again, some say buried, some say he was thrown into the savannah, but Miguelico says that he was buried next to the river.